In many applications, creating a list with a grid display can be very useful. In this video, I will show you how to create a grid in Jetpack Compose. So for this purpose, I create a new composable in my main activity file and I name it, for example, my grid. The composable that we need from Jetpack Compose in order to create our grid is called Lazy Grid. So this is the composable to go for, Lazy Vertical Grid. This is the composable's name, and it has two parameters, cells and content. The cells parameter specifies how you want the cells for your grid to be constructed, the number of your cells and the minimum width of them. And the content, as the name implies, is the place where you put your content, the content of your items. So first I start with cells, and for cells, if you press Ctrl P or Command P if you are on Mac, you will see that we have the type grid cells for this parameter. So I type grid cells dot, and then you will see that we have two options, fixed and adaptive. First I use fixed. With fixed, which is a class and it takes an integer parameter, you specify the count or number of cells or the number of columns for your grid, the number of columns that you want to have in your grid. So I initially start with 3. I want 3 columns to be created for my grid. And if you open fixed by pressing Ctrl and clicking it, you will find that it is a class. Actually, it's a sealed class. Alright. Also note that the Lazy Vertical Grid composable is an experimental composable. So in order to use it, you need to add the required annotation to the using composable. So we will make sure to use that. And as you saw, I also removed the content parameter to move it outside of parentheses and put it in the trailing curly braces. Here is where I want to use my content. So for the content, I'm gonna use the profiles list that I had, this profiles list that has a number of profiles available with names and drawables and also ID that is not specifically here, but we know that it is automatically created for each profile. If you open profile, you will see that it has an ID field or property that is assigned a random UUID each time a new profile is constructed. So now that we have our list of items, I can create my list items with one of the ways that we can use in a lazy scope. For example, I can use items as we discussed in a previous video, or I can say profiles list for each, and then inside the body of for each I can use item to construct each item. So I'm gonna use this one, item, and here we receive a profile and we pass it to the lambda, to the for each lambda, and for the item I'm gonna create a picture, an image. So I use the image composable. For the painter parameter, I'm gonna use painter resource, and for its ID I'm gonna use the profiles image, profile dot picture. And then for its content description, I'm gonna use profile dot name, and then let's use the content scale parameter to have a content scale that is suitable for profile pictures. So content scale dot crop is the one that I'm gonna use, and then let's use a modifier so that we are free to give it our desired width and height. So I'm gonna give it a width of, for example, 100 depth, and also let's give it a padding. Let's give it a background first, a white background, and then a padding of 2 depth, for example. Okay, let's deal with the experimental aspect of this API. Let's add opt-in experimental foundation API annotation to this composable, and then let's create a preview composable for this. So I type prev and press enter. It creates a template for a preview composable, and I specify a name for it called preview grid or preview my grid. And then inside its body I'm gonna call my grid, like this. Okay, and in order to call this and see the output in our device, on our device, we need to make a call to it in our onCreate and set content section of main activity as well. So I'm gonna remove the content that we previously had added for displaying our previous list, and instead I'm gonna make a call to my grid. All right, Let's refresh our preview. The project needs to be recompiled. No, it's fine. As you can see, we have a grid with a pretty nice display, and it's nice. Let's add a background to our grid so that it looks a little bit better. So I add a parameter to lazy vertical grid modifier background, and I'm gonna use a color, a custom color I'm gonna use, and I'm gonna make it 0x 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 8 digits for an RGBA color. And if you click this section, it will open a color picker for you, and here you can select one of the colors that are available from this material palette. So I'm gonna use this color over here, the second color from the first row in the material 300 section. Of course, you are free to use any color that you like. Let's refresh our preview. And there we go, it is nice. Okay, before we move on to discuss the other option to use instead of fixed for the cells parameter, let's change the count parameter a little bit and see how it changes the display of our grid. As you can see, with the 3 parameter, with the 3 value, we have 3 columns in our grid. What if I change it to another number, 2? You can see that now we have 2 columns, and the change is reflected almost instantaneously as you change the value. What if I change it to 4? We have 4 columns. What if I change it to 5? We have 5 columns. What if I change it to 6? What if I change it to 1? We have only 1 column. So you can see that this composable is a pretty powerful API for creating grids. So I revert it back to 3, and again we have 3 columns. Also, if you don't like the height of some of your items that are different from the others, you can also give the image for each item a fixed height so that it is predictable and it has a predictable height. For example, let's use 150 depth as the height of all of our image items. So refresh our preview. And now we have our images all having the same width and height. And probably this is a better display for a lot of apps that are displaying a gallery or a grid of images. Next, we talk about adaptive. Let's change fixed to adaptive. and talk about what it does. In case you are using gridcells.adaptive class, you need to pass the min size or minimum size that you expect for each item of your list. For example, here I want my images to have at least 100 depth of size. And if you open adaptive, it's also another class. Let's refresh our preview. The display is not much different from what we had with the previous option, but from the effect you can infer that using this option, adaptive, allows Compose to divide the available width to the given min size or minimum size and see how many columns it can provide for you. And it decides how many columns it is appropriate for your grid. In fact, you are making Compose responsible for creating the appropriate and suitable number of columns based on the size. And based on your application scenario and your application needs, this might be a better option in some cases compared with fixed. For example, if you are creating a list of files for your application, you have a file explorer application, and you want to allow the user to change the icons size, and you want to allow Compose to decide about the number of columns that it can create for your file icons based on the size that is received from the user or from the user's preference. Let's change it to 200. You can see that now we have only one column, because with the 200 minimum size it can have a maximum column of 1. And if you see the documentation for it, you can see combines cells with adaptive number of rows or columns. It will try to position as many rows or columns as possible on the condition that every cell has at least min size space and all extra space distributed evenly. And it has Alright, let's change this back to 100. And one other thing that I want to talk about before I wrap up this video is making one of these items in the grid selectable. In fact, I want to allow the user to emphasize an item by clicking it, and then as the user clicks the item, I want the scale of the item to increase so that the user knows that the item has been selected and has been clicked. So for that purpose, we are going to use clickable on the image. So I add the clickable modifier to the image. And in order to keep track of the item that is currently selected, we need to use a special function for each item so that we make sure each item in our list is unique. Note that our items in a lazy list require a key so that these items are distinct and unique in the list. By default, the position of the items in the list, like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, are used as key. However, a better way and a more certain way is to provide your own keys so that you know these keys will be stable and appropriate. So I wrap my image with curly braces and I use the function key. With this function, I will be allowed to use my desired key for each item. And because I know that each profile has a unique ID, I can easily use ID as the key here. This will allow me to keep track of the current selected item, the current clicked item, and have a stable way of referencing each item in the list, rather than just relying on the position that is used by default as the key for each item. So, now that I have my profile ID for each image used as key, I'm gonna create a parameter named var selected item. Remember, mutable state of, and because the type of the key is string, I'm gonna use an empty string initially as the type of this state. Let's also import get value and set value. And then for each image, once it is clicked, we make it the current selected item, the current item that is selected from the list. So once this image is clicked, I make the value of selected item as the value of the current image, profile ID. And I specify a scale parameter, a scale modifier for the image, where I animate the scale based on whether the current image is selected or not. So I say if selected item equals profile.id, which means if this image is selected, then increase the scale to 1.5. Otherwise, just use the default scale of 1 that doesn't change the size at all. Alright. Note that this doesn't animate the scale, it just snaps the scale to one of these values, 1.5 or 1.0. In order to have animation for it, I use animate float as state, and then I put the if statement inside its parentheses. I import animate float as state, and because this is a state, I need to use its value, which is a float. Also, I'm gonna use an animation spec so that I can give it my desired animation. I use a spring animation. Let's import spring from the core animation package, and let's use a custom damping ratio, spring dot damping ratio medium bouncy, like this. All right, now let's refresh our preview and actually run the application on our device, because it will give us a better running experience. Alright, our grid is displayed. I'm going to select or click one of the images in the grid, and hopefully it will be animated. The image size will increase with an animation. There we go. Let's select another. Nice. You can see that we see the effect of the used spring animation. That's pretty nice. So we created a pretty nice grid display for our list by using lazy vertical grid composable from Jetpack Compose, and we also added and experimented with a little bit animation for selecting an item in the grid, and I hope that you liked this lecture.